your fire burn. Let your fire burn.
Before we get into today's show, I wanted to talk to you guys about a recent addition to our website at porcupinepov.com called Help Support Us. Through this portal, you can support us one of two ways. First, through direct donation, which of course we always appreciate, or the second one, towards the bottom of the page, there is an Amazon link. If you utilize this link, anything you purchase within the following 24 hours, Amazon will pay us a small advertising fee. And if monetary donations aren't really your thing, that's absolutely fine. If you could leave us a 5-star review on your favorite listening platform, that will help us out tremendously as well. As always, we thank you for listening to The Porcupine Perspective, and without further delay, here's today's show. Hello again, everybody. Welcome back to The Porcupine Perspective. I am joined once again by Evelyn. Evelyn, how are we doing today?
It's been a rough week, but hey, you know what? I'm here. It's all good.
It has been a rough week, and I do want to apologize to the listener. Typically, we're really good about making sure that these new episodes come out on Tuesday. Unfortunately, we had some technical difficulties, and any of you that work with inanimate objects, especially ones of a technological nature, know the problems that we don't often foresee that really throw a wrench in it. So thank you for being patient. We do appreciate it. Now, when we originally were going to record this, it was Easter Sunday, as I remember, and I was preparing for a dinner get-together, and one of the things that I like to have with dinner is, of course, beer. What better way to celebrate a holiday than with alcoholic adult beverages? And I went to the store, and I had forgot something about the state of Kansas, that you cannot purchase alcoholic beverages on Easter Sunday. Now, any of you that know me or any of you that have followed either the webpage or seen any of the arguments on Facebook, you know I'm an atheist. And although I typically do not vocalize my displeasure with religion on the podcast, this was something that pissed me off to no end. Yes, I get it. I could have prepared better. I should have purchased alcohol, and I'm doing air quotes with the should have, on Saturday, or I could have just gone without alcohol that night. Yeah, that would have been okay. Yes, I could have done that, but I've got to ask the question, why is it that we have the state making a law about what I can consume and what I can't consume on holidays that are religious in nature? And I know there are going to be people that are going to say, well, you know, we're a Christian nation. We're not. That, and this is a very important holiday. The least we can do is show some solidarity. Well, to those people, I usually will ask, well, do you mind having a day where no one is allowed to either consume or purchase pork to show our solidarity with the Muslim religion? Or how about a day where you can't eat any beef? We can't leave that group out. And typically, I get a very few people that actually understand the impact, but most of them will say, well, we're a Christian nation, so we have to adhere to Christian laws, which anyone who has had any amount of history, civics, government, knows that there is a supreme law of the land that states there is a separation of church and state. So I asked the question, why is it that you're telling not only me, but let's say a business owner, you cannot sell this product that you have in your store this day? Now, you're still going to have to pay rent. You're still going to have to pay property taxes, but you will not be able to generate any income this day. How asinine is this?
So you're asking my opinion. The
Well,
person
I
who
mean,
doesn't drink very much ever.
well, what better opinion to have then?
Right. Now, I can see the point that you're making on the government stepping in and telling you when you can and when you cannot sell your products or your wares to the public.
Or consume a beverage or take something into your body.
Right. And again, I think that comes down to your fundamental principles, that we had talked about on previous episodes. So I can understand why it was something that upset you as much as it did. For me, it was one of those, well, it's no hair off my back kind of things, or no skin off my back. I thankfully don't have a hairy back.
I wasn't going to say anything.
But who knows? But no, it's just one of those deals where I honestly would have walked right through the store and never given it a second thought. But I think that there's a lot of things that happens with in our day-to-day lives where it's just something we're so accustomed to, you don't give it that second thought. It just, oh, well, that is what it is. Whatever. I didn't really need that anyway. And you keep going on with your day.
So there's a level of, it sounds like you're saying there's a level of acceptance that being exposed to something on a daily basis, that you have this level of acceptance. And if you gave it a second thought, pardon me, that you might have a problem with it.
Possibly. Like I said, with something like this, because it's not anything that I have a vested interest in, normally it's something I wouldn't even notice. I don't know how else to describe it. It's something where it's in there and it's like, oh, well,
It's background noise.
Right.
White noise. Well, then let me ask you this. Since, and granted, you come from more of an agnostic background, both religiously and politically, I know for myself that when I look around in the world today, it is very, very, very difficult to not look at things with, I hate to use the term, these new eyes. It sounds like some crazy, terribly done 80s song.
It really does.
And I think it actually is, now that I think about it.
You got Betty Davis eyes.
I don't remember, but it's something along the lines, these eyes are crying. Yeah, I'll stop. I promise, guys. But,
Please, God, don't sing.
Yeah, appeal to whoever you can.
I will go to whatever deity I need to go to. Don't do it.
I've got a list. But anyway,
the dogs will be a howling.
Yes. But anyway, back to topic. It is very difficult to not look at everything through this new filter, through these new lenses, through whatever metaphor you choose to use. And I don't know. I mean, it's a good point you're making. I don't know if 3 years ago, before I started this journey, if I would have been as upset. I probably would have been pissed that I couldn't buy the beer. But I would have walked away going, hey, you're a dumbass. You should have bought some last night. You know better. This isn't your first year in this state. It's not like in Oklahoma when I was there where, 3.2 beer sold cold. That's the only way you could get it. And that wasn't from a liquor store and served at room temperature. So there is something to what you're saying that experience or exposure leads to acceptance.
I could see that. And again, like I said, though, I do understand the point that you're making in as much as there is an intention for separation of church and state, however theoretical it may be. But there is that intention laid down within our country. And it, looking at it from a logical point of view, I can see the point that you have on why is the state stepping in to support and by their action instill that support upon all of their constituents for a single religious holiday. Granted, it probably goes over more than just single. It's Christianity, it's Catholicism. It covers a lot of those, but to the exclusion of others. And especially in this day and age where we are inundated with all of the people trying to make sure that everyone is recognized fully and equally. Again, you had a good point on, well, why aren't we banning certain other things that are not pillars, but
important?
Well, obviously important. I'm just like, fundamental cornerstones of that religion. There's certain religions you can't eat certain foods, like you said, on certain days. Others you're banned from other foods in general all the time. Others, isn't it the Muslim religion, you can't have anything, any alcoholic beverages because they're made from, is it grain or?
Yeah, fermentation of grain or grape, if I remember correctly. But I think honey they can. I don't know. That was a reference to the 13th Warrior, but
It is a good movie if anybody hasn't had a chance to see it.
it is good.
But
yeah, it's the real mindfuck for me now is the fact that we say there's a separation of church and state, but after you go down this journey, you realize that the state is yet another religion, and how can it separate itself from itself?
there is that.
It's just secular versus non-secular is where it comes to. It's just who you pronounce as your God, whether it be the president or whether it be one of the Abrahamic faiths. But again, I digress. So, in news that is more pertinent or that people will probably care about, I don't know if you saw the article about Thailand seizing a seastead.
That I did not, and you are going to need to clarify for me what exactly is a seastead.
Seasteads are actually something that those of us in the freedom movement are keeping our eyes on. It is a floating home of some sort. Think homestead, but on the sea.
Like Waterworld?
I've never seen the movie. It's got Kevin Costner in it, and I have standards.
Well, sorry. Jeez. I'm just trying to put it in a frame of reference. I don't know.
But
so it's all these like floating rafts all tied together. I mean,
there's a lot of different versions. They're a lot more technologically advanced than floating rafts. This is not a flotilla. They're usually very expensive and luxurious. Everything is taken care of for them. They have the ability to typically generate electricity, renew water. It just depends on what they're doing. But if you can imagine how the Old West was settled, where you had unclaimed territory and people would claim it as their own, as their homestead, the exact same thing is happening in the sea. Historically, a nation claims 12 nautical miles off of its coastline as its territorial waters. I believe it's 12. It's 11 or 12, but 99% sure it's 12. But the numbers don't really matter, I guess. Anything beyond that is considered international waters and has been for a long amount of time. Fairly recently, they declared these new zones around countries, and the countries, of course, declared them themselves. It's a zone of about 200 miles, and it's called an exclusive economic zone. Within this zone, people can travel. You can drive your boat through it because technically you're in international waters, but you cannot utilize any resources, and that does include fish, and you cannot attach anything.
Okay, so are these people setting up these seasteads within this 200-mile range?
In this particular one, they set it out 14 miles away from the coast because they can't be in too deep of water. They can't attach to anything.
Okay, so they're violating the exclusive economic zones then?
Correct, but they are technically in international waters. Well, Thailand viewed this as an attack on their sovereignty, that they are stealing their resources. So they sent out a Navy vessel to go grab these people, and the penalty for this, if convicted, is death. There were only 2 people that were living on it. Again, this is very early stage. I believe it's called a Spire, this particular vessel configuration, and it's set up similarly to an oil field drilling platform where they have attachments to the sea, but it is raised up to a point that the wave action does not affect the upper level that much. Does that make sense? It's not like a rocking boat that's subject to the waves. They would have to get very, very high in order to affect it like a tsunami size. But it had space for 2 people. One was an early Bitcoin investor, and another one was a Thai national, if I remember correctly. The lady was. Anyway, they were smart enough. They noticed a surveillance plane flying over them the day before. They knew what that potentially meant, and they hightailed it the hell out of there and went and sought asylum somewhere else. But not to get too deep into the story, but the thing that intrigued me, and we're going to build on this into the United States about this, is one, obviously, this is one of the negatives of seasteading that people have often said. For those of us that are in the freedom movement, we're really left with very few alternatives other than forming a nation that exists outside of every existing nation.
Okay, well, I'm going to ask maybe a dumb question. I don't know, but is there a reason that they couldn't establish these seasteads outside of that 200-mile radius?
Yes, the water's too deep.
Okay.
Otherwise, you're just a boat on the sea, and it's hard to be sustainable, and you're subject to the winds and storms. There are versions of it, but to have any type of sustainability, and you need to have the ability to trade. And trade is one of the big lifebloods. You can provide a few things, but you're never going to be able to manufacture Band-Aids, for instance, and all the other necessities you're going to need.
Okay. No, that makes sense. That makes sense.
Going back, it was interesting to me, of course, because this was one of the first prototypes that were being built, and we wanted to see how the nation was going to handle it. You could call it a host nation, but I think that would be a term that wouldn't hold out. There's been other trials, but they have usually worked with a host nation, and they are given protection by that nation. So they don't have to worry about pirates and things like that. So the other side of it, of course, is this EEZ, the Economic Exclusivity Zone that is around there. This is literally this arbitrary, this all's mine, and no one else can do anything here, and we're all going to recognize each other's sovereignty of this 200 miles out from the coastline. Now, in the case where you've got two countries, let's say like Mexico and the United States, that are in the Gulf of Mexico within 200 miles of each other, they have to work out their own agreements. But otherwise, it's literally a kid walking up to a sandbox going, this is all mine. No, it's not. Well,
is
yes.
that any different from what the federal government has always done with like land ownership, though?
No, it's actually the exact same. And it's not just our government, but that is kind of a nice handy lead-in into what we were going to look at next was...
Hey, look at me go.
It's almost like you've got a cheat sheet there. So, and I had this question posed to me on Quora. Can the federal government own land? What say you? No cheating.
What? It's not like I have a handy dandy cheat sheet in front of me. No, honestly, they always have to some extent. Whether they say they have or not, they always have.
Can they? Not have they, can they?
If they have, then obviously they can.
What is it to own?
You pay for it in some way. In many ways, you pay for it over and over again.
What about a homestead? Do you own a homestead?
I've never owned a homestead, so I don't know. I don't know a lot, about it, to be honest with you.
Did the people
most I
moving
know
west...
is that they went out and they had to flag a certain parcel of land, and that would be their homestead. So the government would gift them that land. So obviously the government can own land. They purchased it from other countries. They've traded beaded necklaces from my elementary memory. So, yeah.
You're close on the homestead. The only difference is there's something very key in the question. Can the federal government... See, the federal government wasn't granting these homesteads. These were territories. The territories owned the land. The states owned the land. At that time, the federal government did not own that particular land. You weren't getting it from there. But Evelyn is absolutely correct in that basically anything that was quote-unquote unowned by a private entity, you could flag, and then it would become your own. So, back to the original question, what is it to own? You are the person that is responsible for it. You are the person who determines its usage, its outcome. Like when we say we own our own selves. What does that mean?
You own your own thoughts, your own body.
No one else has
that. Right. No one has a right to tell you what you can or cannot put into it or do to it.
And no one has a higher claim to it.
Right.
And anything you mix your labor with, you thereby own it, as long as you own all the raw materials that were utilized to make this, if that makes sense. It's not like you go pull the lever at the factory and you own what comes out at the end.
So I imagine you're going somewhere with this, though. So what, as far as the federal government being able to own land, where is this going?
Who in the federal government is not a person. It cannot own anything. It is a concept. Mm-hmm. The federal government does not exist. You can't point to the federal government. You can't, using the scientific method, show the federal government.
Right, but we have, the federal government is essentially the tripod. You do have the three branches within the government. You've got You've got the judicial, you've got the legislative, and you do have the executive branch. So the people within that do make up the federal government with the responsibilities.
You realize
within.
what you just did, right?
Probably, and I know you're going to share it with everybody.
Probably you realize, or probably you think I'm going to share it. You said the people within it, but point to
Right.
me the judicial branch.
Supreme Court.
Okay, you go to the building owns it? No, of course not. The people do. And don't roll your eyes at me. There's a very important point in here. The individuals inside the federal government do not own the land,
Right.
do they?
No, that goes without saying, but you were asking who is the federal government, and that would be what makes up the federal government.
That's what makes it up. That's not who it is. It is
Okay.
a concept.
Yes. Okay.
It does not exist. It is something that was brought forth from the minds and the imaginations of men,
Yes.
but it does not exist. It was not birthed
Okay.
into existence. Okay. I'm just making sure we're 100% clear
Yes.
on it.
Oh, yeah. I'm clear. Go ahead.
Now, Crongus was granted the right to retain land. A lot of that was due to the fact that there would be things that they would foreseeably have to build, whether I agree with it or not. It's utilized for like air bases and military bases, for instance.
National parks, things of the like.
National
want
parks,
to
that was
maintain,
much,
yeah.
much later. National
Mhm.
parks didn't come into fruition.
Right, but still a part of it.
Yeah, it is now, but it was not at the time they were granted the right. Now, currently, for something that doesn't have the right to do this, do you know how many acres the federal government owns in the United States? You can cheat.
No, I'm actually really not going to look everything up. I know it's millions of acres, and from the time that I lived in Nevada, I know that the federal government owns the majority of that state. Like, there's a very, very small portion that actually is owned by the state of Nevada. But you'll fill it in from there.
640 million acres of land here in the United States is owned by the federal government. That equates to just about 28% of the total land area. And this is including Alaska and Hawaii as well. Now, and you brought up Nevada. Nevada is an excellent example of this. Nevada is a state, but Nevada is 84.9% owned by the federal government.
Yeah, that's not a surprising figure to me, but I live there, so that's one of the deals where I was like, oh, well, yeah.
Now, there was, you're probably, hopefully asking this question, well, how in the hell is it that the majority of a state is owned by the federal government? Should the state not stand in the way and say, hey, this is our land, this is not your land? That was your cue to sing that song, by the way, and you completely missed it.
Nope, I'm not
This
singing
land is your
anything. Don't. Oh, my
land.
God.
Okay.
You just lost your listener. I'm harkening back to the beginning. You're like, to our listener.
Yeah,
Yay, you have one.
and now I have none. But anyway, CLEP versus New Mexico State is where the federal government was granted sovereignty over state lands. The federal government was granted the ability to seize state lands.
So what was this case? I've
Well,
never heard of it.
In this case, the Bureau of Land Management, and I don't know if you guys remember them being in the news a few years ago, involved in the Bundy Ranch standoff, but that was also the Bureau of Land Management. They own the majority of the land in the West, and they will usually cite some endangered species, like some weird desert tortoise or what have you, as a reason for seizing lands. In this case, it was wild free-range horses and burros. There was a gentleman in New Mexico who was a rancher. He owned private land, and he was granted grazing rights on state land. These wild horses were intruding on his private land. Now, he contacted the Bureau of Land Management to ask them to remove the horses, relocate them. They refused. So he rounded up the horses, and he sold them at auction. Did not destroy them, he sold them. The Bureau of Land Management decided that these horses were theirs, even though they're free-range, wild horses, and that they demanded the return of the horses. They didn't even want the money. They wanted the horses themselves, which they were long gone, who knows where. Obviously, there was no way for him to return them, so this went all the way through the court system, all the way to the Supreme Court. And then at that point, the Supreme Court, which is almost always going to side on the side of federal government, especially when it comes to overreach, decided that the Bureau of Land Management was correct and that they could own these lands and anything that was roaming these lands. Now, you fast forward to the last few years, and now the same bureau that was crying foul when someone sold a couple of these horses is planning on destroying 45,000 of these wild horses and burros that are kept in government containment facilities. Now, I stress government containment facility because that is the complete opposite of
free range.
Free range wild horses. Absolutely correct. If the government gets involved, the government fucks it up 100% of the time.
Or that's just showing you that the original intent on them having these lands had nothing to do with the free range horses. There were other purposes meant for it, obviously, with all of these animals being in containment from that point forward. So, again, not trying to do a big conspiracy theory there or anything, but I mean, I think it's a natural conclusion to lead to once you look at where it ended up.
I can't believe you would suggest that the government does not have our best interests in its mind and heart.
You know, I think you've covered that in an episode or two. Just throwing that out there.
Don't blame me. It's not my fault. Oh, I sound like the government now.
No, Jesus Christ. Okay, and there we threw religion in, so continue on with your thought.
All right, so we're going to keep in New Mexico land. I'm not picking on it, but I mean, we might as well keep at least in this area. There was a recent arrest. Did you see anything about that?
I did not.
It was a very high profile, or at least is being made to be a high profile case, where the FBI came down and arrested Larry Hopkins. Larry Hopkins is the leader of the United Constitutional Patriots. Now, this is basically a militia, a private group, not funded at all by the federal government, that is patrolling gaps in our southern border with Mexico. They do not have the power of arrest, but they are armed, and they are heavily armed. What they do is detain people that are coming across, and by detain, I mean they tell them to sit their asses down, and they have guns in their hands, so that probably carries quite a bit of weight, especially to these people that are evacuating these countries where that's very prevalent with the cartels and all the corruption.
Right.
But anyway, once they are detained, they contact the Border Patrol. Border Patrol comes in and arrests them. Now, the reason this is making news is because the New Mexico governor is pitching a fit, I guess, is the nicest way I can say, about these people that are operating within her state on this border, and that only trained law enforcement should be the ones performing this duty. Now, keep in mind, these guys are just detaining. They're not even utilizing their weapons. Supposedly, they don't even draw their weapons on the people. But the governor is more upset about that than the fact that these people are being put into detention centers and potentially deported.
Okay. So she's more upset that they are detaining people at the border than the fact that they're getting put into these centers, the things that Trump put together, right?
Correct. And that's what's so to me, so strange about it is which one is causing more harm on these people. If you are truly for protecting these immigrants, these people pose less of a harm than the Border Patrol do. And what's the difference between these guys and law enforcement? Most of them are ex-veterans. I believe the vast majority of them are ex-veterans, arguably more trained than the Border Patrol. The only difference is this little, and I can't say piece of paper because a badge is a piece of tin. Are they made out of tin?
I honestly don't know.
And I guess it doesn't matter. The only difference between the two is this arbitrary authority invested in certain people. So I kind of wanted to tease out what we thought about this, do a little devil's advocacy. I know, at least on this show, and I won't speak for you, and I don't think, you weren't on the show when we were talking about borders, but for me personally, anyone that has not listened to my stance, I don't believe in borders. I believe that immigration should be free for anyone, and I think it should be the least arduous process that it possibly can be, that every human has certain rights, and these rights do not know borders.
Right. Well, I was going to ask you on that because you sound upset, and understandably, with your point of view, I think that the government, state government, whatever level is coming in and holding charges against these people. But knowing that you believe as you do when it comes to immigration and the open borders, what are your thoughts on the fact that a private group is doing this and is holding these people at gunpoint who are just trying, for the most part, as you said, just trying to come and make a life. Is that not violating your principles against them in some way?
It is, and this is where it gets really sticky, and I want me zoom out just a moment. I don't want these people down there patrolling either. I don't want these people detained. I would rather them be free. I am more speaking to the duplicitous nature of this governor that is crying foul that private people are doing this without being paid, as opposed to the Border Patrol, which is arguably doing more harm to these people. It just goes to show that if it's my way, it's okay. But if it's private people doing it, then we've got a problem. But if they're approved. Now, how do I feel about them down there? That's the problem. And the whole reason we were talking about the concept of land ownership, where it exists outside the private realm. Do these people own this land? No, of course they do not. Does the state own this land? Arguably, the state is no different than the federal government.
Okay, so by your stance then, if the people are the government, then the people in fact own the land, right? So we all own the land.
I don't believe that the people are the government, but yes, if you were to go down that road, yes.
Okay, so we all own the land. So they don't have the right to detain, but if we all own the land, don't they have the right to be there?
They have the right to be there. They have the right to navigate that land, and they can even have guns on that land, but they don't have the right, like for instance, right now, if you and I went down to the border with New Mexico, you and I are both U.S. citizens as far as I know, could they detain us?
Yes.
No, the fuck they couldn't.
No, who? Sorry, rephrase that question again. I just heard you.
The private people, the militia that's patrolling down there, do they have the right to detain you? A private person.
As a U.S., well, in their mind, as a U.S. citizen, no.
What's the difference? And how do they tell? They don't ask for your papers. You just have brown skin versus white skin. And I'm not even calling these guys racist, because that's what the ACLU did. And they're demonizing Trump for it. But the fact of the matter is, if we're all private citizens operating in a common area, no one or no group of private citizens has more rights than everyone else.
Okay, so then what is the difference then between law enforcement and what these civilians are doing? If they're being demonized in this way and being called racist, what's the difference between I mean, I guess they're tying it back into Trump, but I get that, but what's really the difference between law enforcement then and what the civilian group was doing?
From my point?
Sure, go for it.
From my point is that anytime you have commonly owned land, commonly owned property, you run into this problem. Who gets to dictate its usage? Do these private individuals have more of a right to be there than the law enforcement that's there currently? I would argue neither one of them have the right to detain these people. But to be there is a completely different thing. It's the capacity that they're in there. Just like you and I can walk on commonly owned areas, who gets to dictate? Is it just a simple majority on how that land is used? So
basically, if you're saying it's like patrolling your neighborhood, then.
Correct.
Would it require the permission of all of the landowners to make that effective?
Exactly. My point is that this is not annexed. This is private. In your neighborhood, you've got private property butting up to private property, butting up to private property. As long as each individual that own the property gives you the permission to be there to patrol that area, then yes, you absolutely can. But
maybe I'm going to interrupt you here for a second. Maybe that's where they're coming from. And again, you're saying you're wanting to play devil's advocate on this one. Maybe that's where they're coming from on the state level, because they consider it to be state land at that point. They have not given their permission for these private individuals to be there on that land. If you're saying that it's okay and if we're going to patrol our own neighborhood, that it would require the permission of all the private landowners. If the state in fact does own that land and they have an issue with these guys being out there doing what they're doing on what is considered to be state land, because this is the state governor, that you said stepped in and has the issue with this.
Correct.
And so it's not the federal government. So if you're going back into state rights on this one, how is that different?
Because it's a federal border.
But if they're on the state land doing it.
But they're actually on the federal border.
Okay.
That is attached to the state land. And that now we go back to the even bigger problem. You hit the nail on the head. Absolutely. The state doesn't even have the right to determine who can be on this border, because the federal government has seized this line that's on a map and says, this is ours. How much of that border is the federal government? Notice who I said arrested them? FBI.
Mhm.
It was not the state police. It was not the governor sending down the National Guard, because this is federal. Now, I have heard many people make the case, and I can actually see the case where a state gets to dictate how its land is used. I get it. But the state has no say in how this part that is touching their state is used. But literally, it should be the state deciding. And if all the border states decided, we do not want people passing this border, or if people own private property that was the border, and they decided that people couldn't pass, I would 100% stand by it. Just like in the, and we got off of it pretty quickly, but the neighborhood patrol. If people with private property allow you to give you permission to perform X on their property, then you absolutely have the right to do that. But the issue we have is collectively owned property. If everyone owns it, no one owns it. No one gets to dictate its usage. No one person, even the governor in this case. Because ultimately the federal government is the one deciding who is doing it, and Border Patrol agents do not work for the state. They work for the feds. And that's who these guys are calling, and that's who they're working with. But you've got the state governor saying no, but even the state can't bar them from passing on this land because it's federally owned, but it should be state owned.
So you're saying you should have state sovereignty over federal power, at least to start?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And in fact, any student of history would make that argument. The states created the federal government. Even if we harken back to the Articles of Confederation, the way it was stated there, and granted it got changed ultimately with the Constitution, that's what we operate on, but let's do a little bit of history here. The states create the federal government. The states had to ratify the acceptance of a constitution, which therefore created the federal government. The states reign supreme. Anyone that has listened to this podcast for any amount of time has probably heard the term nullification taken. And it's something I firmly believe in. And that goes back to the 10th Amendment. I'm not going to bring up too much of the Constitution here. But the states have the power to nullify any federal law that they believe is overreach of federal power. We're seeing it in sanctuary cities. We are seeing it in some of the gun control measures on both sides of the fence.
You're seeing it in the marijuana stuff going on. Yeah.
Marijuana, you're seeing it in hemp. We're seeing it all over the place. Ultimately, the individual that creates the state, that creates the federal government, should be able to nullify everything. But I know that wasn't your question. Now, what struck me the most about Articles of a Confederation, it literally was a confederation of friends. They had agreements to come to each other's aid if any one of them were invaded. And they had agreements that would allow the free passage of people without passports between the borders of the states. They were treated like nations. Does this sound familiar at all, like something we have currently or that's breaking up? The EU. Mm-hmm. This is exactly what the EU did, is as a citizen in one country, you could pass through all of them. Now, the difference was they had a similar currency, and I can't remember, so I don't want to speak to it, of whether or not that was the case with the Articles of a Confederation. But the really, and I'm going to use the word funny in the bad way, the thing that made the federal government realize how powerless it was and go forth to create the new Constitution, which made a more powerful federal government, was Shays' Rebellion. During this post-war time where they were trying to collect taxes, and some of them were very onerous and very excessive, people were unable to pay. And in fact, this guy Shay left the army because he never got paid. Well, he comes back home, and guess what? He has all these taxes that have been levied on his property. He couldn't earn any money because back then, keep in mind, agrarian society, no one was there to plant his fields. No one was there to harvest his crops. He made no money. He gave up everything to fight in the war, and the government didn't pay him. So he comes back home only to find the government demanding money when it didn't even give him money. And he said, you know what? We just fought a damn war over this. Enough is enough. And it was through this that the federal government realized how powerless they really were. And in walks the road to the Constitution.
Okay. Well, what exactly was his rebellion? Did he just refuse to pay? Or
they refused to pay. He organized a shit ton of people that he was in the war with and militiamen, and they marched on, if I remember correctly, the tax collection agencies. Don't hold me to that. I didn't spend that much time on it, on the actual rebellion in and of itself. as you know, sometimes history can get a little boring in the details, but what the big thing to take away is that government realized that it didn't have enough, so it decided to take more. Does this sound familiar?
The government giving itself power. Yes, it sounds
Correct.
familiar.
Just like we started the episode out with, where, well, 12 miles just isn't enough. I think we need 200 miles. It's a recipe for destruction, and we see it happening even today.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, guys, it's that time of the show again. Time for the final thoughts. For most of us, we can remember, or at least have read about a time in our history when the way we lived was much different, even only 10 to 20 years ago. In many cases, we did not enjoy some of the luxuries that we now take for granted. But do we even really notice? We feel more free due to things like technology and social media, but we haven't really noted what's being lost or given away along the way. We cannot imagine living like that now, but at the time it didn't seem to be a problem. Why? Mainly because we did not know any different. We had not yet experienced what living could be like, and therefore accepted it for what it was. Ask yourself this: what makes the current way we structure our society any different? I look forward to the day when we all can look back at how we allowed a few to use force to govern the many and say, I could never imagine living like that again.
Always look back over your shoulder.